Welcome, everybody, to today's seminar. I'm Nicola Tempini, and I will chair the seminar today of Content to Food from the Center for the Sociology of Innovation of in MIN, Paris, called the MIN. So content is has studied the production of GDP data, and they're used by economists. And also is studying the production and circulation of immunity data in the wake of the COVID crisis. We'll talk about it today, as he gives us a presentation about the moral dimension of data production. How communities of practice define standards for what counts as good data, and as the right way to produce data. Before I give a word to Content, just let me mention that he's visiting us until mid-December. He's also working on the economy of open access publishing, among these, besides these other topics. So plenty of topics and things to talk to him about. Ask him more, get him on e-coffee, or if you're online, or physical coffee in the months to come. He's here to visit us. Without further ado, I should give the word to Content for presentation.
Thank you, Nicola. So hello everyone, and thanks for being here, for allowing me to make a presentation today. So as Nicola told you, basically I made my PhD between Université Paris-Dauphine and l'École des Mines, and my PhD thesis was about how we measure the GDP, the gross domestic product, in practice. I just followed the daily work of French statisticians, actually. And my question was about the conditions of validity of measurement. That is, under what conditions do statisticians consider the number to be valid, to be correct, to be sufficiently realistic? And this PhD thesis is based on a 9-month ethnographic investigation in the French Statistical Institutes, and more precisely the National Accounts Department. So the title of my presentation is Quality Judgment in Data Production Processes, 2 case studies in economic and health data. So I will first elaborate a bit on the notion of quality judgment. After that, I will show how we can use this notion on 2 case studies, that is on economic data and health data. Well, and then I will conclude with a brief conclusion. So let's begin with quality judgment. What is a quality judgment concerning data? Well, to answer this question, I will first talk a bit about my theoretical background, and then I will elaborate on this notion of quality judgment. So basically, my work is at the crossroad of the sociology of quantification and science and technology studies. And let's begin with the sociology of quantification. So to put it simply, the starting point of the sociology of quantification is really simple, is to say that quantification, such as statistics, accounting, management indicators, have a major and even growing role in the organization of modern societies. And the sociology of quantification fights against a naive view on numbers, that is, numbers as neutral representation of a reality. Rather, it highlights what we can call the politics of number, that is, how quantitative representation affects the way we think, we organize, and we govern society. So from this perspective, lots of scholars suggested to interrogate how numbers are produced. That is, what following numbers production processes. And they notably emphasized the role of what we can call measurement categories, or what the French scholar Alain Desrosières calls measurement conventions, basically. Conventions is about agreements. So before measuring anything, one has to define the object of measurement, selecting what is taken into account and what is not taken into account. Basically, that is So the categories or conventions are this process of definition of what counts in our measurements. And this process of definition is often conflictual, historically and socially located. But once it is stabilized, the conventions determine the area of what is thinkable, what is questionable, and what is governable, basically. So, for example, there are lots of examples about the GDP. You may know that lots of critiques pinpointed that the fact that GDP was not a neutral representation of the economic reality, notably because it leans on measurement conventions that have been designed during the 30s and after the World War II by economists and bureaucrats to deal with government problems. And for example, you have this big category, which is the notion of production, which highlights monetary aspects of growth and casts shadows on things like social inequalities or environmental damages. So when the sociology of quantification looks at how numbers are made, it mostly looks at measurement conventions. It assumes that convention entirely determine the quantified representation of a phenomenon. So this assumption leaves an important element behind, that is the work which is made by professionals, for example, by statisticians, to fill those categories, to fill those conventions with numbers or with what we can call data. So to put it another way, the focus on convention measurements assumes that once you have defined your categories, filling those categories with data is a technical and non-problematic work, non-problematic activity that does not affect the way we represent a phenomenon. So for example, you have defined production, and the way you fill this category production does not affect the way you represent the economy. It's the category itself that is important. Nevertheless, when we follow the persons who produce numbers in their daily work, we see that data are not they are not a resource, but a problem to deal with. Yeah, they must be produced, gathered, questioned, articulated to categories, evaluated, and so on. And here is my second element of theoretical background. So with this idea as data as a problem, lots of scholars suggested to describe and analyze the data production processes, basically. How data are made, what do we do with it, how do they circulate, and so on. So that it's what the French scholar Jérôme Denis calls the work on data, or what Sabina and Nicolo call data journey, basically. So many perspectives exist on this topic, but I mainly draw on authors who come from science and technology studies and including what we call laboratory studies. So to put it very simply, laboratory studies have the same preoccupations as, let's say, classic epistemology. That is, under what conditions do we access true knowledge? How do we manage to discover scientific facts? But they tackle those questions not with philosophical method, but with ethnographic methods. So those scholars in STS entered the laboratories and observed what was happening there, basically. Lab studies can be seen as a sociology of scientific activity that analyzes the general organizations of the lab, the way work is divided, the skills, tacit knowledge that are used by workers to accomplish tasks, but it is also a thought on how facts are practically made, basically, thanks to scientific practices and instruments that allow the circulation of a written reference from the bench lab to the scientific paper. So there are lots of scholars who inherit from those lab studies that follow scientists at work and who come from that and who try to study data production processes. So, for example, several persons such as Jeffrey Booker on science archives, Paul Edwards on climate models, Jérôme Denis on open data, Emmanuel Didier on agricultural statistics, and I would say that Sabina and Nicolo with their book Data Journeys can be seen as part of this movement. But maybe you tell me. Okay, so from these two perspectives in STS and the sociology of quantification, I want to study data production processes that lead to quantified representation of the world. And there are probably lots of questions you can address when you study data production processes. For example, how data are packed and to be disseminated for knowledge claims. For example, how data must be fixed to produce a consistent representation of a reality, or even what kind of work and materialities are required on different data sets and so on. But what interests me regarding data production processes is the question of quality. That is, under what condition can data be considered as correct, as reliable, as usable for a community of practice? So a classic way to answer the question of quality, to tackle the question of quality, is to oppose pure data on the one hand and artifacts on the other hand. Artifacts that can be the result of errors or manipulations on data. This opposition between purity and artificiality is emphasized in times of crisis where doubt is cast on official numbers. For example, in 2010 in Greece, you have this huge controversies on the figures of debt and deficits that directly derive from national accounts and GDP calculation. And in this controversy, each camp accused the other of manipulating numbers for their own profit despite the economic reality. So I won't analyze this event basically, but we can find here what Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison call mechanical objectivity, the idea that you can have pure data, so they speak about fact, but we can apply that to data, the idea that there can be pure data independent from their production context, and that would give a neutral access to reality. So against this dichotomy between purity and artificiality, I suggest that the quality of data cannot be defined in general terms. Rather, data quality is a practical problem that statisticians solve through an intense moral activity. They elaborate what I call quality judgments. By those terms, I refer to a set of techniques, knowledge, know-how that helps a community of practice to define and evaluate what a correct data is in specific contexts. So quality judgments imply consideration on the right ways to accomplish the work, on the characteristics of the results to be achieved, as well as on the legitimate use of this result. They involve a reflection on the division between good and bad data, but also on the very nature of what the data is, including in its most material dimension. Quality judgment can vary over professional groups or even within the same group, and their variation leads to different definition of what we can expect from data. So after saying that, in what follows, I will talk about two case studies in which I will use this notion of quality judgment. Basically, quality judgment on economic data and quality judgments on health data. So the first case study is about economic data. As you may know, the national accounts or national accounting is the main representation of what we call the economy, the national economy. And inside this framework, the national accounts, you have the GDP, which is the most famous and most aggregated indicator of national accounts. So in France, national accounts are produced on an annual and semestrial rhythm by a group of about 60 persons, which is named the National Accounts Department, but I will simply call it the department to be simpler. So you have the department that produces national accounts in France. And the department is part of the French Statistical Institute. So you have the department, the French Statistical Institute, l'INSEE, and this French Statistical Institute, here is the building of the French Statistical Institute, and it happens to be in the southern suburb of Paris, in Montrouge, and it's also where I live, but there is no link between the two. So this Statistical Institute is itself part of the French Ministry of the Economy and Finance. So what do national accountants do? Very simply, they collect multiple economic data that come from the French statistical system, and they integrate those data into two accounting tables that provide two different perspectives on the economy. So, it doesn't work.
Try just clicking, just on a.
Yeah, using the mouse.
Yeah, use the mouse once,
Oh.
and then it'll.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, perfect. So they gather data and they put it into two accounting tables. Those two accounting tables, they are in really tiny pictures there, are the overall economic table and the input-output table. But to be simpler, I will just call them table A and table B. So you have the departments, table A and table B. Okay. So those tables have a long history. I will not elaborate on this aspect, but let's just say that they come from economists' work in the early 20th century, and they have been standardized and reshaped during since the 50s by international institutions. And today, the structures are stabilized in the national account system of accounts published by the UNO and the European system of accounts for European member states. Well, I closed this historical parenthesis. So we have those two accounting tables that the department must fill with collected data. And since those tables are accounting ones, they follow a basic rule of equivalence. That is, the categories that are shared by the two tables, such as the GDP, must be equal. They must show rigorously the same number. Nevertheless, in practice, the calculation processes of those two tables systematically lead to unequal results. That is, the level of the GDP in the table A is different from the level of the GDP in the table B. And this inequality is highly problematic because it harms the consistency of the overall economic picture. And to come back to a unique number and to a consistent picture of the economy, national accountants will intervene on the tables. They will modify figures during what they call arbitration, l'arbitrage, which we can translate by arbitration. So basically, they make use of quality judgment. They evaluate the quality of their data and modify some of them. So my question is very simple. How do those statisticians, those national accountants, evaluate the quality of the data? What kind of operations do they implement to come back to a consistent representation of the economy? And the argument is to go back to a consistent representation of the economy. They make use of quality judgment through the evaluation and production of what I call economic narratives. So we will see that the department does not see numbers as mere calculation results, but as economic narratives that one must evaluate and may transform. So to put it simply, statisticians must judge the quality of the numbers to modify some of them and reach an accounting equality. First, they answer the question: which number can we modify? We'll see that the department leans on several definitions of what a number is to answer this question. And the more original definition is to see numbers as economic narratives. Second, they evaluate numbers, economic narratives. And third, they modify numbers and reach a consistent representation of the economy. So I will simply present the steps quickly. So first of all, on what number can we intervene? So after several weeks of work at the department, the national accountants have a table A and a table B that are quantified and relatively stabilized. So as explained before, the accounting principle implies that the two GDPs must be equal, but in practice, national accountants observe gaps that harm the consistency of the economic picture. So the mission of our statisticians is really simple. To reduce the inequality, they must select some numbers and modify them. But the question is, on which criteria should they intervene on the number? To answer this question, they use different definitions of numbers. So the first definition is to consider accounting numbers as the result of a calculation process. That is the use of mathematical formulas, basically. This approach helps to assess the accounting system's consistency. With this approach, with this definition, you can ask, did we correctly use the calculation rules? And this approach allows national accountants to identify the gaps between the two GDPs. The size of the gap is not predictable. For example, in 2013, it was not that huge, minus 1 billion euros between the two GDPs. But in 2014, it was a huge gap of 18 billion euros. So this definition is important, but it does not help much when the inequality is not linked to a calculation problem. To be precise, the gap between the two GDPs is a direct effect of the calculation mechanisms. Each year they have this kind of problem. It's a structural problem. Okay, so the second way to define numbers that will help them to know on which number they can intervene is to say that numbers are not the result of calculation, but the object that fueled the calculation process. That is raw data. Numbers can be seen as raw data. So the department does not produce its own data, rather it collects it among multiple suppliers at the French Statistical Institute and elsewhere. And according to national accountants, there is a hierarchy among those raw data. For example, accounting data are considered as the most reliable ones, thanks to their proximity with national accounting concepts and their supposed exhaustivity. Statistics are seen as less reliable because they are not exhaustive and subject to extrapolation. And finally, some accounting categories simply does not have any raw data associated with them. They are filled following accounting rules of equivalence, and they are seen as more doubtful. So this hierarchy can be this hierarchy maybe seems really weird, but because, well, it's not necessary, you could have built other hierarchies, but it helps national accountants to identify the figure that can be modified between the two GDPs. To be precise, the table B, the GDP of the table B, is partly filled thanks to rules of equivalence. while the table A is filled with accounting and statistical data. So when there is a gap between the two tables, the department decides to transform the table B, which relies on less reliable data. So we are making progress. From now on, we know that national accountants must intervene on the table B, and the table A will be left as it is. But some problem remains, actually. The GDP is the result of a calculation process that uses many table cells. So the department's team still must decide on which cell of the table they can intervene. So to understand this idea, I will just make a little technical parenthesis, and I'm sorry about that. So the table B represents the economy as a set of products. And for each product, you have an equation that shows its production process and its uses. So you have a product, you have here the production process, production minus intermediary consumption, and you have the uses. The production process is equal to the uses of the product. And what we call, those equations are built by business statisticians. They are not directly, they do not work in the department, but they are closely linked to the department. They are from the business statistics department, but they are linked to the national accounts work. And what we call the table B is basically the gathering of those equations. So you have 139 lines for 139 products plus a total line. And this gathering of lines is made by what I will call the GDP team, which is a team of national accountants. So you have lines which are made by business statisticians, and the gathering of those lines made by the GDP team, which oversees the gathering and aggregation of the equation. So I won't give more details on this, but the point is, if you want to modify the GDP on the table B, you can intervene on each line or even on each cell. So you still have to find a rule to know how to intervene on this. And to do that, they use a third definition of what a number is. Numbers can be seen as economic narratives, and here I draw from the work of Mary Morgan mostly. Economic narrative, that is, numbers say something about the economy. They tell a story about the state and the dynamic of the economy. This third definition allows the statisticians to refine their intervention on the table B. It is now possible to consider each cell, each number, basically, and to interrogate the narrative's quality it conveys. Good narratives will remain, while bad narratives will be changed until the two GDPs reach an equality. So how do national accountants distinguish between those good and those bad narratives? That's what we will see now. So most of the arbitration process, most of the arbitration process takes place during a collective event named the consensus meeting, les concertations en français. The consensus meeting lasts 3 days, during which each line of the table B is scrutinized following a precise schedule. You have the same configuration each day. So actually it's an office. In a large office with several workstations, 2 groups are present. On one side, you have the GDP team that have that gathered the lines of the table B. On the other side, you have business statisticians that individually produced each line of the table B. And you may have seen one lonely blue square, and basically it's me, the ethnographer. So I made observations during 3 half days of those meetings, and I was systematically sitting beside the GDP team. So the purpose of the consensus meeting is to identify which number can be changed. And this identification process unfolds in 2 steps. So the first step is to use what I call narration criteria. So during the meeting, the GDP team interrogates number with what I call narration criteria. Narration criteria are hypotheses on the very nature of the economy, on how it can behave. They help to define what one can or cannot say about the economy. What is a right or a bad narrative, basically. One major criteria is temporal continuity. A number will be credible when its evolution follows the past trends, and it will be doubtful when there is a trend gap, that is, when it differs too much from the accounts of the previous years. So this criterion is a hypothesis on the nature of the economy. It implies that the economy is a dynamic object whose variation is always smooth, that is, in the continuity of the past. So if you are in the continuity of the past, it's okay, and if it changes too much, it becomes problematic. So temporal continuity is really a tacit knowledge, tacit tool at the department. It is an epistemic perspective on the economy, but it is also like a sorting device, actually. The department does not have enough time to scrutinize every cell of the table B. So the temporal criterion is a simple way to select the few numbers that will be closely examined. So the most important point here is the effect of the criterion. It allows national accountants to select some numbers and to weaken the economic narratives by saying that a given number is suspicious. The second step is to justify economic narratives. So narration criteria are not sufficient to decide whether a narrative is robust or not. They must be discussed. There is a discussion. And here come business statisticians who produce each line of the table. Unlike the GDP team, business statisticians have an expertise on a specific aspect of the economy, not on the whole economy. For example, information on agriculture products come from several statistical surveys carried out by the Ministry of Agriculture and the Central Agricultural Office in France. And during the consensus meeting, business statisticians try to justify the numbers they have that have been weakened by the GDP team. Here is an example. During the 2013 account, the GDP team leader sees a huge variation on corn price, up to 300 million euros. And to justify it, the business statisticians gives an explanation about the corn market structure and its prices. So she says, data on prices come from cooperatives. Cooperatives bridge the gap between the farmers and the buyers. On the one hand, we have the anticipated prices that cooperatives give to the farmer when they deliver cereals. They sell at the highest possible price and obtain a margin which they redistribute to the farmers. Some years, the resale is less successful, so we have negative margins. Prices are very volatile from year to year. So basically, it's really hard to understand, but the idea is, okay, you told me that my number wasn't good, so I give you some explanation about some precise explanation about how my numbers have been produced and why there is such volatility, for example. So under what conditions can national accountants accept to modify a number? It depends on the nature of the justification that business statisticians will suggest in front of the narration criteria. In the example of corn, so you see it's very specific. They go very in the details of economic sectors. For example, in the example of the corn, justifications about the crop pricing system are convincing enough to strengthen the number. But of course, some numbers will be fragilized during the consensus meeting when business statisticians have no justification. For example, during the 2014 account for the product architectural activities. During the consensus meeting, you have the GDP team that uses another criteria that is an alternative measure. Sometimes they have alternative measurements. So the GDP team uses an alternative measure to question the production level of the product architectural activities. According to the GDP team, the number used by the business statisticians differs from another business indicator. So it's weird because it should be about the same. So without elements to justify the production level of the product, architectural activities, national accountants allow them to modify the numbers. So the discussion between the GDP team and business statisticians enable them to identify the number that can and that will be modified to reach the equality between the two GDPs. Nevertheless, the question remains how to produce a new acceptable narrative. And here again, we will see quality judgments. So I go back to the example of the architectural products. The GDP team uses an alternative indicator to cast doubt on the production level of architectural activity. In this scenario, the GDP team can modify the number and basically it suggests a new number to get closer to the table A. Here again, it will be a little technical. I'm sorry about that. How to get closer to the table A's GDP? Actually, you just have to raise the production level for the product architectural service. By raising the production level, you raise the added value and you raise the GDP of table B. I'll show you that here. So here is this awful table B. And for example, here, the GDP team leader suggests adding 1 billion euros on the production level. So she suggests to add 1 billion euros and the total and hence the GDP of the table B will rise by 1 billion euros. Why 1 billion euros? Why not 10 or 100? 2 points are important here. First, the GDP team must choose a number since the accounting system produces inconsistency. So it is a really specific context where they are obliged, if they want to reach an equality between the two GDP, they have to modify the number. And second, this process of modifying number is not arbitrary. You can identify several rules that national accountants follow to make their quality judgments. For example, a number that would increase the gap between the two GDPs is not acceptable. For example, if you suggest minus 1 billion euros, it will increase the gap and it's not acceptable. A number that would not respect the narration criteria, such as the temporal continuity, will also be rejected. The complexity of national accounting partially comes from its systemic aspect. Numbers in the table B are not independent. Each line is an equation that must reach an equilibrium. Hence, when you modify a number, you affect other numbers on your equation. When you produce a new economic narrative, you impact other economic narratives and potentially harm their plausibility. So after suggesting a new number, plus 1 billion euros, the next step is to check its effect on the other numbers. And business statisticians do this checking. In our example, they must say how the plus 1 billion euros on the production affect the other accounting categories, such as investment, such as consumption, and so on. And this checking is important because the other categories have not been weakened by the GDP team. So you cannot completely transform the equation. What about the plus 1 billion euros? Basically, business statisticians notice that with this plus 1 billion euros, you have a dramatic effect on investment. Before the plus 1 billion euros, the investment only increased by 2%, and after the modification, it grows by 4.8%. So numbers here are not really important, it's just a dramatic raise. So the plus 1 billion euros involve problematic changes, and it cannot be accepted. But we can be sure that the production level for the product architectural services will be modified. We just do not know the extent of this modification for the moment. And this extent is negotiated during a process of trial and error. So the first suggestion, plus 1 billion euros, was too high. So let's try another number, for example, 600 million euros. This new number allows national accountants to come closer to the GDP of the table A and does not move too much the variation of investments. We had 2% and now it's 2.2%, so it's not that dramatic. So from an accounting point of view, the number 600 million seems relevant, but we understood that the intervention of the table B is not only about accounting balances. Workers try to reach an agreement on a plausible narrative for the product. And to do so, business statisticians suggest a narrative that will strengthen the number. He tells a story to explain and justify the number. He says, in 2015, professionals say that the building sector is increasing. In 2014, architects produced. From there, it makes sense to raise the investment level by 2.2% instead of 2%. The GDP team agrees for 600 on production. So basically, the idea is we cannot just put a new number, we have to produce a story that explains this number. Okay, so a brief conclusion on that. Calculation processes are not enough to guarantee the robustness of numbers. In this case, we saw that calculation rules produce inconsistencies that must be handled. And to do so, workers use quality judgment. They evaluate the quality of the numbers defined as economic narratives. And they intervene on it to go back to a consistent picture on the economy. Okay, I'll move up to my next case studies that will be shorter, hopefully. So the second case study is it's only a project for the moment because it should be my future postdoc research project. A few words on the context of this project. In 2019, the French government created an institution called Paris Santé Campus, or Paris Health Campus. And this institution brings together research organizations, universities, corporations around health data. For example, we can find l'INSERM, a public research organization on health and medicine. We can find different firms that support the creation of big instruments such as medical imaging. You also have the Health Data Hub, a public entity that gathers public health insurance data, or a university such as PSL University, Paris Sciences et Lettres University. And the ambition is to create, the ambition of this institution is to create synergy between scientific research and private sector to enhance health data, the way we process health data. Another goal is also to implement higher education training courses on health data. So as part of this big project, there is a small department dedicated to social science and health data. And the staff of this department comes from several French universities and grandes écoles, which is highly selective establishments. So my future postdoctoral research is embedded in this context and in the social science department. And I had the opportunity to write a research project on health data linked to my preoccupation about quality judgment, basically. So what's the starting point? Really simply, health data is a major factor of change in public health. And among the numerous issues that they raise, many actors have highlighted the issue of data processing, as in the case of Paris Santé Campus, because one of its ambition is to develop instruments, technology, algorithm that will enable us to use health data and to produce knowledge about, notably for public policies. And lots of social science scholars emphasize the political, economic, and social consequences of such models or algorithm on data. Those works basically fit into what I call the sociology of quantification. They are interested in the production and effect of measurement conventions. You have this with models, you have your categories of model, with algorithm, where you have to define the categories that will process data. My point is that when you focus on models, algorithms, or categories, you come to consider data themselves as a simple raw material, as if data were naturally stable, available, and easy to use. So such properties, such as availability, usability, stability, if they exist, are the result of a complex process where the existence of data is never presented as a resource, but as a collective problem to be solved. So in addition to the reflections on the way we can process data, this project wants to open the black box of health data. How do we produce this health data? And among the many questions raised by health data, you understood that I'm interested in quality judgments, basically. That is what I've called the set of techniques, knowledge, know-how that helps a community of practice to define and evaluate what correct data is. So my goal is to follow health data production processes and to tackle this question of quality judgment. So from an empirical point of view, I aim to study the production of a statistical survey named EPICOV. And this statistical survey was conducted by two public research institutions, l'INSERM and l'ADRES, in collaboration with several public and private organizations. It leans on a nationally representative cohort of 135,000 individuals. So this survey, this statistical survey, has been launched in 2020 in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. I'm assuming that we are much more close to the end than to the beginning. So it was in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. The goal of this survey was to help public decision makers, to manage the effect of the pandemic. The survey is divided into two parts. On the one hand, an immunological part that seeks to follow the immune status of the French population by collecting blood samples that are self-tests sent to the respondents. And on the other hand, a part on living condition based on surveys of individuals about their living condition, basically your questionnaires that are filled. So within this statistical project, I aim to follow how statisticians conducted the first part of the survey, how they produced data on the immunological status of the French population. And to do so, I identified 5 important steps that punctuate the work on health data. So first, the first step is the creation of the cohort, how you select your sample, basically, the people that will be part of the experiment. The second step is when you collect blood samples, how do the statisticians conducted that? The third step is the moment when you test samples in laboratories to evaluate the antibody levels and so on. The fourth one, producing visualization of health data for this decision maker. So this statistical survey is linked to policymakers, basically, because it aims to fuel public policies, and so you have to make specific visualization for decision makers. And the last step is using the data in policymaking. So the last step, using those data in policymaking. So the research question that I have really simply is, what kind of quality judgments punctuate the different steps of the work on health data? So this general question invites us to address several sub-questions, such as what are the different professional groups in presence? What types of expertise do these groups mobilize to define what good data is, to make quality judgments, basically? How those different groups manage to reach an agreement despite the different versions of quality judgments, and so on. And methodologically speaking, it's about, well, qualitative sociology and close to ethnographic inquiry. I would like to conduct interviews with the practitioners who have been involved in the production process of those health data. So that's also why I identified 5 steps, because I want I assume that each step brings its own specificities regarding what kind of quality judgments, what relation to data they have. How much time do I have? Because I see it's...
I mean, 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I have to finish. Okay, I go fast. And so I want to make interviews, and just the third step, which is laboratory test, can with this step, I would like to make observations, because you have laboratory practices with blood samples. Okay, to finish with this case study, I will talk to you about expected outcomes, because, you know, with project you have to have outcomes. Let's say some elements about this. So the first outcome concerns scientific cooperation. So this big institution, Paris Santé Campus, aims to bring together multiple organizations around health data. And the success of such a project depends on the synergies that will occur between these organizations. So the analysis of the epidemiological survey will provide descriptions of an exemplary case of scientific cooperation. It allows us to formulate thoughts about the practical factors of success of a scientific cooperation that involve health data. Second, concerning the relationship between scientific work and political use. Health data crystallize frictions between actors and goals that are most of the time different. For example, you have the requirements of scientific protocols, which are not the same as political agendas, for example. And investigating quality judgments on this statistical survey allows us to grasp the entanglements of these frictions and how, under what condition they can be resolved in practice. The third element is about transparency on health data. As you know, the collection of health data raises many questions in terms of individuals' privacy. And I think that an ethnography of this survey will provide an intelligible account of the ways in which health data are produced, and it can basically fuel public debates. Okay, in 1 minute, a conclusion. So I talked to you about quality judgment with 2 case studies and on economic data and health data. And well, I just want to pinpoint 2 ideas. First of all, measurement categories are important but not sufficient to analyze numbers and their politics. For that reason, I came to data studies and STS to analyze data production processes in practice. And second, the work on data implies, that was basically the main point, implies a moral dimension, that of quality judgment. That is the idea that data, to be seen as correct, must be evaluated and sometimes transformed by practitioners. And this is the end. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to answer your questions if you have it.